Thank you to everyone who's joined. I see the captions. Hopefully everyone else who needs them can see them as well. If you cannot, please let us know. Raise your hand and we'll troubleshoot. That's awesome. I need to do that all the time.
I'll send you my contact. They're amazing. I love
Please,
them.
thank you. Pause this. I'm actually going to stop this background. Like it's nice, but then I feel like it makes me look like I'm in what's that big movie with the blue people?
The movie with the Blue Man Group.
No, the one that won all of the awards.
The blue people.
I should know this. Huge movie, like 3 years old.
Avatar.
That. I'm like, why is this not
Matthew Cortland for the
huge?
win.
Yeah.
To turn on your captions, at the bottom of the
I think
window.
Stacey Ross.
Oh, did Stacey
Stacey
get
put a
booted?
note in there as well.
Okay,
And you
cool.
switch it back. She Ross.
Oh yeah, that's important. I'm glad you flagged that, Jordana. Let's make sure you can see the captions. Oh, sorry. Hold on. I did something, apparently. I'm sorry. Please let me know if that fixes it.
You'll probably have to reassign me now.
My apologies.
No problem. Okay, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you for flagging that, Jordana. I'm just checking to see if he is here.
She said to start without her. She'll be about 5 minutes late.
Okay, awesome. One of the first lessons I learned in Washington, D.C. More than a decade ago was to be flexible. I also learned the importance of hurry up and wait. And so with that, I want to say thank you to all of you who thought it important to give of the most precious resource, your time, to engage in a discussion today about inclusive social justice. I essentially really want to say social justice, but feel at this point it's important to say inclusive because there's still some work to be done. For those I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is David Johns. I'm happy to be the quarterback of the team at the National Black Justice Coalition. We're the nation's only civil rights organization that is intentional and unapologetic in standing in the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA+ equality. And for reasons that I don't think require enumeration, I am weary. I'm tired. I was on the phone with Becca 15 minutes ago trying to scarf down food for the first time today. But the thing that has gotten me through today is knowing that I get to share space with my family, my sisters, people who have been, to be clear, on the front line, in community, in connection of power, centers of power, doing this work before Pride Month, before people were talking about the connection between the current riots and the riots that founded this country. And to be clear, when this moment passes, they will continue to be doing this work as well. We will soon be joined by Iffy Ike, but in this moment, I want to acknowledge Rebecca Coakley, who is formerly now at the Center for American Progress, but is one of our nation's leading advocates. She is an advocate first and foremost, and she is a disability expert, among other things. Becca is a member of my family, and we also share the distinction of having served still my president, Barack Hussein Obama, and his fabulous wife, Michelle LeBon Robinson Obama. Melissa is my newer sister. We were connected through my sister, Rebecca Coakley, and she founded and leads an organization in South Carolina that is designed to be disruptive in all of the ways that are good. Iffy is an attorney who leads Pink Cornrows, the founder of Black Policy Lab. She's a strategist who has worked in a number of spaces, including New York City and Washington, D.C., and she'll talk about some of the work that she's leading as well. And it's really my goal just to center, not just, but to center the importance of inclusion and intersectionality tonight and the time that we have together. Too often I find that people use those terms and have no idea what they mean. And so I've tapped in some experts to talk about their experience with the hope that those of you who are doing this work will feel affirmed and maybe learn some new resources. And those of you who don't yet know why you should be doing this work are convinced that you should be in the arena with us. And so my first question by way of introduction is really, I think what most people are asking is, how are you today? And I sort of struggle with, like, you really don't want to know how I am today. We don't have the time. And that's going to take us in another direction. So I want to know how each of you, what is your source of joy? How are you getting through given everything that's going on in the world?
V, why don't you go?
I think for me, my source of joy this week has been just really good conversation with people I haven't talked to in a while. Just being affirmed and having laughs and just really having safe spaces. That's, for me, kind of goes offline. That's been my joy this week. Just really doing a lot of self-care, some unplugging, a lot of reflection, paying attention to how I feel in both my emotions and my body. I think that's something sometimes we get disconnected on, particularly in these moments. So just really seeing, if my body is hungry, eat. If I'm thirsty, drink. If I need to rest, rest. If I need to sleep, sleep. If I can't sleep, to understand, and not the only one. So just being very in tune with myself and leaning on my support system at this time has really brought me joy this week.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Becca, other than your beautiful babies.
I am praying that I love my beautiful babies. I'm praying they stay down in the basement. Where they are watching TV, they are not locked in a basement. They are down in the basement with their dad watching a movie. And so for me, it has been pretty similar. It's been reaching out to folks, reaching out to you, David. I had a long talk with Iffy last week. V, you and I are always in communication, and I think in times like this, like reaching out and staying connected to the family, to our folks, pulling in newer folks that are working on figuring things out. I think also, I'm not going to lie, this is going to sound really funny. A dear friend got me a Nintendo Switch Lite as a present about a month ago. And I have joined Animal Crossing, and I am part of a crew of supporters of Julian Castro's campaign that have this ridiculous sense of community on the game, and like run games within the games. And it really has the same spirit that the Castro campaign really had around like mobilization and camaraderie. And it's very positive and constructive, which sounds really goofy, but it's like something that I find really joyful right now.
I appreciate that. Iffy, welcome, sis. You are right on time, as always, literally right on time. We started the conversation by acknowledging all that's going on in the world. I didn't name grace, but talked about the importance of appreciating it and being able to share space with each of you. And I gave a little bit of context for how you show up in the world as an advocate and an attorney and an agitator, somebody who does lots of good. And the question that I asked both Felissa and Coakley, Becca, I'll call her Rebecca because I usually call her Becca. And this space, I feel like they call her Rebecca, put some respect on it. I love her, so I call her Becca. The question, Iffy, is, and it was prefaced by this, I think often we are trained to ask each other, how are you? And I find myself saying to folks now, I don't think you really want to know. So the question is, what's your source of joy? How are you getting through acknowledging everything that's going on and all that you carry?
Well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. I apologize in advance because one of my joys is my dog, Bishop, who is barking right now. Everybody knows that I don't believe in policing any beings, including dogs. So he is talking to us right now. I will say, in all honesty, because joy is not connected to happiness, for me, although they overlap, I've found joy in the simple, just the simpleness of being alive. And recognizing that at this moment, it is not only being a privilege, but I get to be alive in spaces where like I have community I can vent to. I've cried multiple times, even in the middle of work, and it's been okay. I have increased my, both increased my awareness and sensitivity to loved ones. I think Felissa said speaking to people has been an odd just joy, just benefit to hear from people all over the country, outside of the country, from people that are checking with me. You know, I have like relatives that are like, "Are you okay over there?" And I'm like, "Don't you walk 20 miles to work?" Like, I mean, it's kind of like, "Are you okay?" But it's this like sense of like not invisible that is helpful at a time. As you know, David, and many folks may know, I'm currently in Brooklyn, New York, and we are dealing with an extreme escalation of what has always been pervasive, which is over militarization in our streets. And now we are facing less than 2 hours until our curfew, which unfortunately for me kind of elevates my anxiety that I already have. But I also take joy in the fact that I can feel. So yeah, I think that that's joy in like just feeling the humanity of all and just not being afraid to feel everything right now.
Yep. I want to stay exactly in that space and acknowledge that while for so many in the world, this feels new, each of you live this every day, right? I think which contributes to the joy that we are now finding in the seemingly simple things like conversations with people that we otherwise might have been too busy to catch up with. And the weight of feeling like we have to respond to everyone's request for help. And so if you mentioned the word not invisible, 2 words, not invisible, which again, I honor. There are so many more people literally right now in this moment that are following me in BJC, watching to see what we have to say than were last week. That's not lost on me. So there's a part of me that feels more visible. But acknowledging the ways that socially constructed identities and barriers operate, there are parts of me that are still very much invisible, right? So I get calls from reporters who want to ask about what Black people should do. I get calls from reporters that ask about what gay people should do. I've yet to get a call from anyone who's been thoughtful enough to ask what are queer Black people continuing to do, because you all have always shown up in this space. And so I want each of you to speak to how intersectionality shows up through you and in your work in ways that you want people who are listening now and in the future to learn from, and really help us to appreciate how even in moments of extreme hypervisibility, there's still so much that goes ignored and undiscussed. Becca, why don't you start?
I think for me in the day-to-day, a lot of this has been, a lot of my time is frankly being spent doing white people's work. I had a friend several years ago who, upon the death of another friend, told me that my assignment going forward was to fix the white people in the disability community. And I take that charge really seriously. And so there were multiple occasions this week, largely as a result of Biden releasing his disability platform, which he was the last candidate to do so. And it was done in a awkward way with the community. And so while our white leaders were like, yay, yay, rah, rah, why aren't we lifting this up? Why aren't we talking about how great this is? Why aren't we mobilizing as a community writ large to fix the things that aren't great in it? Our Black and brown leaders were struggling. And the white leadership is not paying attention to that. And so a lot of my time this week has been blocking and tackling for folks, has been readjusting expectations for people, has been frankly doing a lot of privilege checking, and our office was closed today. And I'm really glad it was, because it actually gave me a chance to like sit and breathe and process where I'm at in this space. But I really feel like within the disability space, white leaders have had so much privilege for so long. and haven't done enough to provide opportunity, have done more gatekeeping than opportunity providing, haven't shared mics, and haven't brought folks along with them. And so for me, it's been also intergenerational, because this is largely, a lot of this is coming from our elders, and who mostly work at organizations that aren't diverse, where a lot of us are striving to change that. And so they're putting demands on us while we're working on shoring up and supporting and lifting up and giving our staff grace and space and like infrastructure, not infrastructure, but like thinking about what does the scaffolding need to look like around our young Black disabled leaders, our young brown disabled leaders, our young queer disabled leaders, and folks at all those intersections to help them get through this period.
I appreciate that. Iffy?
So I like to think that, you know, before we knew the word equity, I think many of us were in that space. Now there's this, then it evolved to this cute word of corporate social responsibility, and then it's evolved into social impact. So I like to say that the wave of like being in this space is, and trust me, I've tried to escape a couple times, but this is just the work that I do, right? That being said, I feel like when you're in it, the longer you're in it and you're clear that you're not in it as a profession, but you're in it because it is about how we all live and exist, then the keenness to what ways can I help to ensure, and David, you know, I use the word invisibility a lot, like ensure that those things that are invisible but also have mass impact are raised as much to the surface as I physically can. I'm not always perfect with my execution, but I do also think that that's something that I work on, is like fighting against the perfection, which is also built on a white dominant culture standard as to how can things present to the world as being ready to discuss. And oftentimes the discussing of certain things have to be packaged in a certain way. And the more intersections you leave, you also have to get approvals from other people before it's even seen as credible before you've even started. So in this space, you know, even though I you know, do have a background in research, and there are different ways that I would create instruments. I worked on launching the COVID While Black study, not because anybody had prompted. It was done because I was denied testing before I even told my full symptoms over the phone. And when anybody who knows anything about Black women, we know our bodies. So when something is off, I don't care if it's COVID or Cocoa Crisps, something is off. And when I called and literally was like, something is wrong with my foot, it doesn't seem right. The first thing that I heard was, you know, we're not testing you, right? And that slam was one of many reminders that you can't out-degree racism or inequity or bias. You can't out-profession it. You can't out-slogan it. You can't out-allyship your way out of that. Those are the realities that are so invisible that on the micro level, those are they're not even micro, they're life. That's what life is. The erasure of essential workers and clapping for the essential workers we want to, but then ignoring the other ones only to raise by name so that we can check the box and say that we're not ignoring predominantly Black, brown, immigrant, differently abled people that are, as we're speaking, bagging our groceries and doing the things that nobody wanted to do pre-COVID and are still doing it, is part of the reason why on a very micro level, I changed my name for the little bit of people that knew who I was to Essential Worker's Daughter. My mother is a nurse, but she's also in her 60s. And my dad works in security, and neither one of them have really had a break. And so I think that on a very, very like personal level, all the way to how can you create space for other people to then fill in their narratives, that's kind of what I find my role to be right now. But I also know that like my love language is also policy. So I love to think that there's room for us at the table, and that the strategies that are yet to be created, whether it's in labor or whether it's in politics, still come from the communities that are left out. So as you know, David, when we collaborated on COVID While Black and Queer, we were also envisioning who then needs to be at the table. And to be honest with you, even in since that, we then started talking about COVID while Black and immigrant, and COVID while Black, and like we started just going like COVID while Black and differently abled, COVID while, because what we recognize is, for people like us, when we say Black, it's inclusive of all of those things. But for people that live those realities, it's actually not. So COVID while Black does not automatically mean that somebody who lives an intersectional life of Black and the oppression that often comes because you're Black and LGBTQ, that doesn't signal to you that, oh, this is a survey for me, right? So without a partner like David, we were not able to, we could have created the survey, but we also needed a messenger and a delivery that was authentic and also safe for communities. So we have a ways to go, but what I don't want to get lost, especially at a moment where still 25% of all COVID deaths are within Black communities, I recognize that we also have to capture the voices of people that may not be here tomorrow. And so that is also part of what I think is part of the equity conversation in the midst of all the brutality that is ongoing as well.
No, I'm honored to be a partner with you in that work. Is it, we're still collecting data, right? Is it, you want to share how people can take the survey?
Yeah, people can go to they can go to either. They can go to, because that's also the point. You can go to bit.ly / COVID while Black. You can go to, we actually are encouraging now for people to go to to bit.ly / COVID while Black and queer for a lot of different reasons. In addition to the fact that we added some specific questions or more refined questions to gather more insights. And we're happy that we'll also be starting this Sunday, reaching out to predominantly immigrant communities to find different ways that they can also provide insight and insight and voice. We do really encourage individuals who have experienced any type of pre-existing condition or any type of health issues to also fill it out, because we're trying to again see what tools are working with our community, and we always acknowledge the barrier of what it means to have a survey that's online with a camera, with a computer that requires broadband. Like, we know that there are also biases in how it's distributed, and everyone is not able to necessarily fill it out the same way. That being said, we ask people to really encourage supporting somebody else get their voices documented in the survey, and just, it could be through a Zoom call or whatever, but gather voices from your neighbors, from your family members. We're really honored to know that there were, and just very quickly, there were people that did critique and say, well, you could have said it, there's a scientific term to say, this word or that word. And the whole point was to make it accessible to everybody to feel like they could engage with it. So when I had friends that said that multiple uncles filled it out, that's important to me. That's important to not only the research, but to how we engage people and validate their contribution, regardless of how they say what they say or what language or expression they use as they're saying it, if they're saying words at all, right? So I think there's many ways that we can find and perfect within community accessibility towards our own family members.
The word that always comes to mind when I hear you talk about the work, really your mission, is praxis, right? The space where the policy or the theory meets the practice. Melissa, why don't you talk about how this shows up in your work and in your life? So much of what you do is to make good trouble, to use a phrase that a couple of my mentors use.
For me, when you say intersectionality, it made me think about a conversation that I had yesterday about movement work, and the fact that we don't talk about how many people in movement work, particularly when they do direct action, can sustain disabilities. And we don't talk about how the lack of talking about disability in this work is very prominent. Particularly Black folks, we do have a high percentage of having disabilities. So we bring, our disabilities to this work, and then because of this work, it can be exacerbated. So I know we have a lot of talks in this space, but it's really telling how movement spaces avoid talking about disability. We don't give people spaces to talk about, and doing direct action, like what we're seeing now. People are being exposed, physically exposed and traumatized, and being out there. And what kind of support are we giving them when we don't give the space to be honest about that? When we're silent about it, it creates this air of shame create this air of inability to have these honest conversations. Many leaders in this work, whether they're veterans or newcomers, are going to sustain some type of trauma in what they're doing. How are we giving them supports? How are we showing up for them? How do we create safe spaces for people to have these conversations to where we don't have to be so littered with ableism, but we can be very honest about the realities of doing this work, particularly in putting your body, your Black body especially, in the front lines of this every day that we've been seeing, and as a social worker, these are the things that I think about, in providing resources, providing safe spaces for people. And as a community, particularly Black folks, we do shy away from being honest about disability. That's historical reasons, cultural reasons, and then the whole idea of not wanting to add one more thing to our list of Blackness and, something else. So I think that in some ways, the movement work does a great disjustice in shying away from the topic of disability and addressing the ableism that hinders people from being honest about the lives that they lead before they came into this movement work and then after, and seeing how can we create these safe spaces that is greatly needed, because it's not just our generation of folks who have disabilities. There are generations before us who have them as well, but have not felt confident or strong enough to share, what those experiences are like. And so that's been really on my mind, in watching the protesting every day, seeing people who I know who are not used to being on the front lines and the veterans that are, and just wondering who's taking care of them,
Right.
when it comes to the support that they need.
Right. Let's stay in that space. I saw Becca responded to one of the questions that I'm going to bring up for all of you to answer toward the end of our conversation. But someone asked, how can I explain to my coworkers at a disability organization who are worried about racial justice distracting from our disability work, or otherwise suggesting that racial justice makes our disability advocacy stronger? How would you respond to that? What advice would you have for our colleague?
I would actually refer to the first time I met Iffy. We were sitting at a conference table at a pre-meeting for the United States of Women conference. And it was hosted by our good friend Tracy Younger at the Ms. Foundation for Women. And everybody was going around the table introducing themselves. And as the only person with an apparent physical disability in the space, I always prepared myself. It's like, all right, when it gets to me, I'm going to be the one that brings up ableism. I'm going to bring up the fact that, I'm in a room with 30 people. So statistically, at least 7 of them are parts of the community. And the number will be higher because it's specifically a room full of women at multiple marginalizations. And Iffy, who was like the third person to introduce herself, like threw out ableism in her introduction. And I had never had that happen in any non-disability space ever. And I'd been doing this work at that point, since I was like 15. I had never been in a non-disability centering space where I didn't have to be the first person to talk about ableism. And so when the break came, I immediately went over and was like, okay, we're going to be friends. And I think one of the things that's so important, and one of the things that Iffy said that day was like, we're all here. Like, there are women with disabilities in the space, and it's important for us to name it. And just as it's important, just as we continue to say, we need our quote unquote progressive, we need our radical allies to understand that a quarter of the folks that they're working with at any given point in time, a quarter of the folks at your protest, a quarter of the folks at your board meeting, a quarter of your grassroots advocates are people with disabilities, whether they live with bipolar disorder, whether they have eating disorders, which we never talk about, especially at the nexus of race, LGBT, and gender spaces, whether they have a chronic health condition like IBS or IBD. If you're at home and there's a pharmaceutical ad and it speaks to you, you're part of the community. But just as we've been pushing the outside folks to do that, we have to have those same conversations in our spaces. And we have to have a real, frank conversation about white supremacy in the disability rights space. I mean, I remember when I was President Obama's diversity officer calling disability organizations saying, Okay, I literally, when Mitt Romney made the joke about binders of women, that was my office. I kept the binders. I actually built a fort of them at one point. And I said to the disability community, they sent me their lists, and I remember like going through there and there being no disabled, like maybe 5 disabled people of color on a list of 3,000 people. And I was like, no, like you have to do better. I was like, if I can pick up the phone and call the NAACP and tell them that President Obama and our crew are not coming to their conference because all they sent me were men over the age of 50 to look at. I have to tell the disability community, like, where are your disabled people of color? Where are your women in leadership? Where are your immigrants? Where are your LGBT folks? We have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to hold our leadership accountable. And we also have to think about what are the opportunities to build that pipeline. I know V probably has thoughts on this too.
I do, as always, when it comes to this stuff. The way that people try to compartmentalize movements and justice work is astounding. And the lack of understanding how you cannot expect people to compartmentalize their identities. Because when I step into a space, I'm bringing my Black disabled woman self, and everything that I do centers around that. Everything that I'm exposed to centers around that. Everything that engages with me centers around that. So I have a really big problem of organizations talking about it's a distraction, when honestly it's not a distraction. You all have been avoiding it this entire time. So let's call a spade a spade. This has been avoidance work. And like Rebecca was saying, our leadership was white. It wasn't until I became part of this movement when I discovered some of the Black disabled figures in history and its work, finding out their names finally, finding out they're disabled, and understanding how the whitewashing of our community hinders Black people and other people of color from knowing our pioneers, knowing our trailblazers, and how that type of omission is so dangerous and harmful. So for any organization to sit here and say, particularly in 2020, that anything's a distraction, no, you just don't want to do the work. Let's just call it what it is. You don't want to do the work because you don't see it as a priority. You don't see it as importance. And you don't care about the experiences of disabled people of color. You don't care if you're using that type of thinking to reason why you cannot, do this work. We can all chew gum and walk, wheel, limp, skip, jump at the same time. And this is what these organizations need to do. And when you're not doing that, we're going to hold you accountable. We're going to call you out, as we have in these past few years with certain organizations and leadership. And we want you to do better. Like, there's no excuse at this point. Like, particularly now with the use of technology and social media, your organization has no excuse to not know or reach out to disabled people of color, and especially not paying disabled people of color for their work. But that's a lot of exploitation when we come to organizations who are clueless and then try to get on board with everything and then seeking disabled people of color as the tokens and then want to exploit our work. There's a whole lot of that going on for these new awakening entities. So being very conscious of how are you upholding white supremacy in these spaces? How are you upholding whiteness in this space and protecting whiteness, and the inability for you to address it in a way that lessens the harm that gets done in this community? Because there's a lot of harm that gets done when organizations don't want to talk about racism or race, or if they allot it to the particular months where certain groups get observed. Because we are Black, brown, and so forth every day, not just in February, not just in April, not just in September. So just being mindful as to how you are being either a problem or being an accomplice or co-conspirator in what you're doing.
Listen, the doors of the church are open. They're going to be a virtual ushers coming down the aisles with collection plates. And we're going to deliver the benediction and let y'all go, because I don't know what else there is to have to say after that.
Well, at least allow us to share our Cash App. Don't close it too early. If you're gonna open the doors.
I think we're gonna really open up.
David, no. I have a question for you. Actually, I want to pose a question to you, my dear friend.
Oh Lord, okay.
You and I go back a ways now, and you have always been to me, one of the most receptive, one of the most welcoming, one of the folks that really got it. Like, I never felt with you that I ever had to make the case about why disabled folks needed to be at the table. I mean, I don't even know how many projects we've collaborated on where you called me and been like, hey, who are folks in the disability community that I should engage on X? Who are the experts on Y? What advice do you have to your peers across other civil rights spaces about like why this actually matters and why they should do it? Because we can keep banging at the doors, but I honestly think one of the ways that you've always been good at using your microphone and your privilege is like throwing out the table that's been set before you and frankly setting a new table with your friends because we don't like those other people anyways.
Period. Yeah. I appreciate that. And I also received the challenge to continue to be doing more, not which you intended directly, but which I'm in honoring for myself. I'm going to say earlier on, I grabbed that napkin and I was crying. I was crying in part because Becca's story reminded me of recently being with Iffy at Google in New York, where we were at a similar table talking about mental health and I wasn't in the room. And Iffy made a similar statement like, we need to talk about and include Black queer people because if we don't, especially while David is not in the room, then David's gonna cuss me out. And I say that because my answer to the question of why we need to do this is because we literally cannot do it on our own, right? Even if I wanted to honor the responsibility of being there to represent my community physically in that moment, my biological needs prohibited me from being literally at the table at the moment when I needed to be at the table. And so I share that story because for me, it serves as an analogy regarding everything that's going on in the world, right? Like there are more people right now who are interested in what it is that we're talking about. And there are literally not enough of us and not enough hours in the day, hours in the year, Beyonce inspired playlists to get us to be able to show up and meet all of those needs. And so really this is a long way of me going back to what is a part of my core and being a Black feminist and honoring something that Fannie Lou Hamer said a long time ago, which is that I know that none of us will be free unless and until all of us are free. And so my hope is that, and even in part of why we decided to do the series in this way, including in this month, is to highlight that we are much more alike than we are different, and that our differences should be celebrated, not as deficits, but as things that allow us to add unique flavor when we're able to cook or come together. I think that's how I would try and answer. Iffy, did you have a response to that previous question? And or maybe one of the other questions that's come up are, what are resources that exist for people who are trying to do better and want to learn more? Becca shared in the chat Melissa's Black Disability Syllabus, which can be found at rampyourvoice.org, 3 words ramp, and then your, and then voice altogether.org. What other resources exist and or tips would you provide for folks who want to do better or be more engaged in this work?
So I sit on the fence with this on giving advice because, and I think you actually said something like this, David, on Twitter. I think part of how people get there is the journey. So this is interesting because in some ways I'm probably cutting some of my church dollars right now, but part of when I'm asked to come into spaces and do trainings, I've learned not to come in with an assumption of what the audience knows, right? But not because I'm smart, but because I've gotten burned at times, thinking that there are some basics that people know, even if they're not applying, right? So even as Melissa was speaking to that prior question around like the dilemma that people feel that they have when it comes to race and ability, which in some ways it's like, so are you just talking about being a human being? Like, I just want to be clear as to which characteristic is not human, right? Like it's really weird to like engage in those conversations being that we've had individuals that were differently abled since the beginning of time, and the intimacy, just so people are clear about how deep the erasure is, the intimacy of what it means as a people of color, but specifically as Black people who were intentionally maimed while building this country. So we talk very much about Black people were enslaved and they built this country, which is still a very Black patriarchal setting. No, Black people who were then beaten, who were then maimed, who were disfigured, built this country. And if you look at it from that perspective, none of the work that anybody does wasn't built with disabled Black people doing that work. So I don't care how you spin it, you're going to have to include us in not just the, yes, there should be some type of lens as to how do we do better outreach, but you also have to include us in the existence of your organization, right? So there is like just a foundational conversation that we have to almost not assume that people know. And the other thing that I don't think we should assume is that everybody understands what white dominant culture is. And I don't even say dominant culture anymore. I call out white dominant culture because part of this narrative is that we are doing ourselves a disservice by not talking about how white supremacy is not just sheets, and we all know that, but we still have people that still think that the Charlottesville scene is what white supremacy is, when instead it's also about any of us with all of the intersections that we live with being overqualified and underemployed or under prioritized. There's so many different ways that white supremacy shows up. So white supremacy is not just about privilege, but white dominant culture is also about seeing what you think is right as the default. So the problem with white dominant culture is that we don't question enough, right? So I actually don't have a problem with the question, like, how do we talk about both race and ability? I don't have a problem with the question. I do have a problem with the question, with the thought that one would automatically like erase the other one out. And if we're honest with ourselves, the one drop rule still applies both literally and figuratively in so many parts of our lives that people do, whether it's women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ folk, when Black, especially Black, gets raised. Because I've worked with spaces where we can talk about immigrant culture all day long, but we don't talk about Black. Well, I'm a first generation American. So you're still erasing a part of who I am by not wanting to talk about the realities of Black life here, but feeling very comfortable talking about immigrant life. So I think I'm gonna hold back on resources. Sure, I have resources, but I'm gonna say to folks, Google. And I'm also gonna say to folks that not everything you Google is right. So some of this is also about daring to be wrong, braving to be wrong, and trying to do the right thing as opposed to doing nothing. Sorry about that. I told y'all. And if I yell at him, I'm gonna look like I'm an abusive mother. And
Bishop is co-signing. It was punctuating the point.
I mean, I guess so. Melissa's a social worker. I don't want to have no problems with the state. But I say all that to say that I have issues at times with the like, tell us what we need. And also another characteristic of white dominant culture is they don't like to sit with shit, excuse my French, but there's oh my God, this is a problem and I gotta fix it. It's like, no, oh my God, there's a problem, identify it in your life, right? Identify how it shows up in your life and identify how you've been mistreated as a result of it. And also how you've been bamboozled as a person who does have a culture, but that culture has been erased in the adoption of whiteness for the falseness of safety and separation from other cultures, right? So I think that there's, I hesitate with this audience. I think that, especially in the moment that we're in, I do think that we need to sit with what's going on right now and all the lives that we're uplifting, but also challenge ourselves, especially in our workspaces, of all the lives we're not talking about, and recognizing that both present the moment that we're in as far as like what beauty it is for all of us to be united and fighting for Black life, and also acknowledging that there are some Black lives that we're not even raising, right? And just sitting with it and not try to like fix it overnight, but then do the work. And that includes finding your own library of research. And then after you Google a couple times, then you can reach back to me. I'll send you a book or two.
It feels, there's a part of me that both, I'm struggling with this because I'm like, it feels real simple, but then I also know that the simple is a thing that is often overlooked because some of what we're talking about is just teaching history, right? Like reclaiming or acknowledging, as you just described, Iffy, that like, It is not the case that to be disabled in this country is to be white and disabled, but it is to be a person who has a disability, right? Like, and it feels so simple to say, but it is often the thing that we don't do, right? Like kids don't learn about this stuff in school. So acknowledging that, I think the challenge will be, among other things, when we are not dealing with a global pandemic that requires us to be socially quarantined, is that these kinds of things are often added to the list at the bottom.
Well, and even
And
in
so if
the
there's a,
sorry, I was going to say,
Mhm.
even in the history that we do learn, it's so sanitized. I mean, you
Right.
mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer earlier. Most folks don't realize that Fannie Lou was disabled. She had polio and was involuntarily sterilized because of her polio, was not told about it, got married, decided to have children, couldn't figure out why she wasn't getting pregnant. And when she went back to the doctor that she had seen growing up, he was like, I sterilized you because people like you shouldn't have kids. You know, when Harriet Tubman's story is told, it's never told with a lens on the fact that she had a traumatic brain injury, and that she actually framed it as part of her narrative. And I think that was one of the reasons, like V and I and so many of us online on Twitter were such huge fans of the show Underground, because Underground was the first time that we had ever seen Harriet Tubman's disability displayed as part of her character. And we like, and the cast was so amazing. We were going back and forth with Aisha Hines and Misha Green, talking about it and being like, you don't understand, for our community writ large, for kids with epilepsy, for kids with traumatic brain injuries, like this is never shown. They're never told that Harriet Tubman had a brain injury, and she actually made that part of her canon. Like she told people that's where she got the visions. And to think about, I mean, I remember like we showed My Babies, we showed Jackson the episode, the standalone episode with her monologue, and it was incredible. You know, and it's still to me one of the best hours on television. Like I actually put, you know, people always, and I love The Wire, people always cite The Wire as the best show nobody watched. To me, Underground is actually higher than The Wire in terms of the best show that nobody watched, and I blame everybody else that didn't watch it for it getting canceled.
And I want to add one thing about a little bit what was mentioned about the historical aspects of Black people and Black disabled people in this country. I'm going to post a link to one of the most important bodies of work that I read. It's called Mothering the Useless, which gives the account of disabled slaves. And I love that body of work because it really showcased the way Black disabled bodies were viewed during that time and how it's still being viewed now. If you could not contribute to the institution of slavery, you were considered, you know, a liability. You were considered useless to your slave owner. And, you know, in that body of work, it talked about the plight of enslaved mothers for their disabled children. How you, as a woman, having to try to protect your disabled child when neither of you consider a person. You know, and what was discussed earlier, you know, our movement not recognizing race and disability is so ridiculous to me because it's in our history. You know, and Black disabled people have been here, always been here. You know, either we were born disabled or became disabled because of the institution of slavery, but we've always been here. And reading that particular body of work was just really profound for me because it's not really discussed about the experiences of disabled slaves and what it meant to be useless in the sense of your disabled body and mind, but also useless or property because of the color of your skin, and how that really transpired, you know, and how they looked at themselves and how they were particularly exploited because of their disabled bodies, especially. So I really think some of this erasure and ignorance is due to the fact that we don't know our history because, like what Becca was saying, it's so sanitized and it's so non-disabled centered. And you know, and that goes within disability history as well as Black history too. You know, because we have to call ourselves out as a people in the erasure of Black disabled bodies. You know, that's Black disabled people. I was an African American studies major, minors in college, and I had never read anything about disabled slaves until I became an activist. Now that's a problem, you know, when it comes to, you know, the access to this information so that Black people can understand the entire Black experience and not just the non-disabled one.
Yeah, learning about the experiences of enslaved Africans is still for too many, both African descendants and not, too infrequent and too shallow an encounter. And we've talked, Iffy and I recently even talked about, I'm developing some children's books to try and complicate that because it does go back to erasure. I'm checking to see if there are any other questions from the group. Y'all have been running through them, a lot of them, and there are also some resources that are being shared in the chat, including from Hackman Consulting Group. And Belisa also shared the link. I will commit to saving this transcript, and if there's anybody who would like it, if that's helpful, I'll send it to each of you as well, so that that can be a part of the archive. The only question I'm asking myself in this moment is, what more can I and other individuals who are active accomplices do, right? This is the moment where most people use the word ally, which is a word that I hate because it's too passive, and make space for people that in the queer community watch Will and Grace and quote Lizzo songs and the like. So what more should people be doing?
So I'm going to request in this space that we treat it less as like we go around in a circle and just like talk like we're at a dinner table. So please interrupt me at any point. I miss dinner tables. I miss restaurants, sorry. So feel free to, grab the bread and jump in. So in the spirit of what we're discussing, you all know, at least you four know, or you three know, I mean, I teach a course called African Americans in the Law. So it's very dear to me that we do understand history and understand the erasure that's not there, that has existed. And it's on us to actually search that history and infuse that history in how we are discussing our existence. The reason why I appreciate that course is because the feelings that, the experiences that people see Black people going through are often interpreted as feelings. And people do not understand when we say systemic racism, that means that the laws were literally created, right, to ensure that there were these boundaries. You add on to that intersections, then you are talking about either the inclusion or the invisibility of you as a person, period. And why that's important is because we have to then figure out why today we are continuing to erase, and some of it is not that we're doing it intentionally, which is not to take away the responsibility, but now that we know, I think that people need to look at even the whole concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion, scrap all of that, throw it in the trash, literally. Like, it needs to be burned, lit. It's awful. There's a reason why it's a almost billion, if not billion-dollar industry, and yet places struggle on how to, treat people like human beings. And part of that is that it's focused on addressing little fires everywhere in the workplace instead of understanding how the fires were actually created. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not willing to invest in the creation of the problem, I would actually say, as my dad likes to say, treat me like a stranger. Most strangers we treat with respect. I don't know if you got a gun. I don't know what you got in your pocket. You stay over there, I'm gonna stay over there. I always tell people, don't even treat me like a human being, treat me like a stranger, because strangers actually get optimal respect, which means that if you are treating me any less than a stranger, there's a reason for that. And we just have to be willing to investigate what is the reason for that. There's no more questioning, does it happen in the workplace? Does it happen at school? Does it happen with unemployment? It happens. And that just needs to be like the beginning of truth. And then we need to move forward. In my opinion, part of it is like infusing not only history, but also not just saying we're going to bring in people to lead this work, but to completely like accept the fact that you're going to have to struggle with how your mind receives information. And that's all people of all demographics and all ethnicities and backgrounds. We've all been programmed in this culture. And it's only because of our extra exposure and unfortunately at times being oppressed and suppressed multiple times that puts us in spaces of being experts through pain, not experts through research, right? And the final point is like, which is why it adds insult to injury for people that do not experience these types of marginalizations to still be the leaders in doing this work, right? So in some ways, give up your Cash App, you know what I mean? Like, move out the way. And we need to be more vocal about that. And even for those of us that have a little bit more privilege, we need to also be okay hearing that and or recommending other people, which I can proudly say with this circle, that happens, right? We proudly say this ain't for me, or there's somebody better.
So before Becca, you tap in, and then Melissa, you'll have the last word. Iffy, drop your Cash app, let people know how to connect with you after this.
Really?
Yes. People are asking me all. I mean, yes, really. Let people invest in the work.
My Cash app it's Thinkify or Think Iffy, ThinkIfy. I'm so excited. I'm about to get some coins.
And people should follow Pink Cornrows as well as well to connect with Iffy and the work.
Iffy, I was drinking pink bubbly tonight for you specifically. Like Patrick pulled out,
really?
the
You didn't
rose
share.
bubbly. I know. I'll send you a bottle.
Thank you.
Grizzly works in New York, so I'll just ship something to you.
Thank you.
You know, I think one of the things for me that I think about a lot is the power and like the risk of people coming out. And I think one of the interesting things to me is we celebrate people coming out for all things. We celebrate people coming out as LGBT. We're now celebrating folks. You know, I have friends who celebrate when a loved one gets divorced, leaves a bad relationship. We celebrate that. Like, hey, let's get you some stuff. Let's restock your apartment. Let's like send you some booze. Whatever it is, we'll do that. Why do we not celebrate when somebody comes out with a disability? Like they're acknowledging a new part, a new space in their life. And I have a colleague who was in my Rockwood cohort, and at some point in our cohort came out as the fact that his son had just been diagnosed as autistic. And a lot of folks in the room were like, I got you. I'm so sorry. And it got to me and I was like, welcome. I was like, we've been waiting for you. Like, let's connect. Let's get you set up. Let me connect you with autistic peers that are your age so that you can see what the potential is for your son as he gets older. You're in the Bay, so let me connect you with folks from your community who have all different types of disabilities. Let me help you build your nest. Let's do all the things that we would do for anybody else that had a coming out sort of experience. But yet when somebody comes out as having a disability, and yeah, it does require life changes. And for some folks, let's be really real. Like for some folks, it sucks. Like for some people with chronic illnesses that would do anything, like people always assume that I would cure my dwarfism. And I'm totally happy being short, even though I really wish I could like take my alterations off on the taxes, because like paying twice for y'all's clothing is real bullshit. But if I could cure my migraines, like with a zap, I would do that in a minute. And so like having that conversation around like it's a different thing for everybody, but yet there's power in that certainty. There's power in that diagnosis. For a lot of folks, there's like an understanding of like, this is what it is now. Now I can figure things out. Why do we always recognize that as a tragedy? And I think it comes to that whole conversation that Via talked about, like with capitalism and the push to be productive, which is a real tenet of the disability justice movement, which was founded by our colleagues out in the Bay at Sins Invalid. But like, it really is to me, like why, when someone comes to you and says like, hey, I just found out that I have ADHD and I'm on meds now, and it enables me to be focused in a way I've never been focused before. Why do we say, I'm sorry? Why instead are we not like, that's awesome. You figured it out. Like what supports and service, like how do we connect you to that space? So that's like my big like takeaway. And now V for the last word.
Yes, but before that, Becca, I want to ask something of you as my sister. I want us to, the power of the story to me that you told is that in that moment when that information was shared, you demonstrated with compassion and concern that there was going to be somebody worthy of it having been disclosed to. And so for the reason that like, oppression works through people being expected to come out, I want you to adopt my term of inviting in, right? Like that person always had the disability. I've always had my everything. When people demonstrate, other than the fact that I now have a job that requires people to assume But when people demonstrate that they are worthy of this information, that they're not old, they are inviting us in.
That's awesome.
I want you
I
to
will
use
do that.
Yes, I love you. Vicky says she loves you too. B, the last word goes to you. All can. What's the best way for people to connect with you and follow the work, Becca?
Twitter at Rebecca Coakley.
Awesome. Last word goes to you, V. Take us home.
Okay. Well, and think about all the conversations, particularly when we address privilege. I have one thing to say, hashtag get out your feelings. When people call you out, on you erasing them, on you not knowing how to discuss issues, because it's not about you. It's about you doing better. When people call you out, they're holding you accountable. Some call outs can be in love, some may not be, and that's okay. But get out your feelings. I think when a lot of people, are told that they're not centering voices, not, making room at the tables or allowing people to build their own tables, when they're not, being willing to discuss anything but X issue when it's an intersectional need to do so. Get out your feelings, because you're doing more harm than good when you're centering yourself, when you're feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm messing up. Yes, you probably are messing up. But what are you going to do about it? How are you going to create the spaces that are needed so that 10 years from now, our communities can all look different? I always tell Black folks, you cannot get to liberation without Black disabled people. And I say the same thing to white folks. You cannot get to any type of liberation without us. So understanding that we are really in this together. And when we are calling you out, whether it's justified or whether we see that your organizations are too white, or your organizations don't address disability, or your organization doesn't address disability from an intersectional lens, it is needed so that the harm, the lack of community feeling that has existed for so long, does not exist anymore. So get out your feelings and figure out how you can be a part of the work instead of continuing to uphold the status quo, which is ableism, white supremacy, homophobia, transphobia, queerphobia, and all those things that allows a lot of us who are on the margins to not be seen. Addressing your own privileges. I know people come at me all the time, about my own privileges. I'm like, I can rattle you off all my privileges, and I am not ashamed of either one, but I know how each one has allowed me to get to a certain space, certain lane, and how I can yield to others who do not have those same privileges. So not being ashamed of privilege, but understand that how they work and what can you do to yield time, space, money, resources, opportunities for people to progress in ways that's not easily done for you. So get out the feelings and figure out how to get the work done.
It's appropriate that you ended right at 7 o'clock, which is the time where people are literally coming outside to applaud for essential workers who are literally in the front lines and who are also doing this work. Valisa, Rebecca, Becca, and Iffy, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, David.
Just thank you. I love you each, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.